Dr. Kissinger. It's my pleasure to have an opportunity to make interview with you. Last year, your book on China came out. You discussed the development of China, but what was your main message?
My main message was that China and the United States are at a point where they can make a decision to work together as two great nations or act as adversaries. I believe that China and the United States should work cooperatively because we're living in a new world, and the old view that rising powers are opposed by established powers was true in the past. It's not valid today. And so I was addressing this book primarily to American audience to tell them to look at China as a partner and not as an adversary.
During the 2012 presidential campaign, you criticized the two candidates for China bashing. In your book, you just claim that the China will make a peaceful race. So what does China's development mean for the whole world?
Look, I think in both China and the United States, there are people who argue that we are condemned to be adversaries. But I believe that China's peaceful rise can contribute to a world in which certain fundamental problems get solved on a global basis. It can remove the danger of war between major countries. And it can set an example. If China and the United States cooperate, then many problems can be solved. If they do not, then every country in the world can attempt to play us off against each other.
美国前总统尼克松与前国务卿基辛格这两位风格迥异却都充满着智慧和野心的政治家的合伙，取得过许多举世瞩目的政治成就。但是，两人的结缘却存在一种复杂的关系，微妙还有矛盾。在总统竞选期间，基辛格利用自己的影响力，对总统竞选人尼克松展开了猛烈的炮火，但最终并没有阻止尼克松登上总统宝座。令人倍感意外的是，基辛格极端鲜明的个性、独到并富于创造，给尼克松留下了深刻的印象。于是，一面之缘外加相似的外交政策和基本主张，让两个男人共同走上权力巅峰的道路。
What happened to your relationship with President Nixon in 1969? It was a dramatic time, wasn't it?
Actually, I never met President Nixon until he was already elected as president. And we had a dramatic time together. And the most important decision that was taken in the first months of the administration is that we would open relations with China, or attempt to open relations with China, because we didn't know whether it was possible. But then after 3 years, it did become possible.
Now, what made President Nixon make a change and open the door to China, as you know?
President Nixon believed, as I believe, that the basis of a country's foreign policy must be a view of the national interest and not ideology. So President Nixon believed that China was a country of enormous importance and a long historic tradition, and that it was excluded from the international scene, partly by its own decisions, but that an attempt should be made to bring China back into the international system for the benefit of China, but also for the benefit of us, of the United States. And that was not the usual view at the time, but we persisted and brought it about.
新中国建立以后，中美两国关系长期处于紧张的对峙状态。鉴于世界政治力量对比发生变化，美国总统尼克松和国家安全事务助理基辛格有着共同的主张，那就是同中国改善关系。如何访华成为尼克松任总统期间最富戏剧性的事件，可在当时美国却鲜为人知。如若公之于众，光走美国政府内部流程就已极大阻碍的访华进程。因此，基辛格在1971年作为总统特使秘密访华，就成为了一次秘密的奇幻之旅。由此而来，中美穿梭外交堪称他一生最丰厚的政治财富。
In 1971, as President Nixon envoy, you made the secret trip to China. As you boarded the plane, what was in your mind?
Well, as I boarded the plane, I knew I was on a historic mission. I did not know exactly what I would find because I had no experience with any Chinese official or diplomat before. And Premier Zhou Enlai was courteous enough to send a delegation of 4 Chinese officials to escort me to China. But I did not know that before I got on the plane. And I had 2 Secret Service people with me. And when they saw 4 Chinese in Mao uniform sitting there, they were getting very nervous. But I thought, sometimes you're fortunate enough to be able to participate in something unique. And so that was my feeling, but also a little uncertainty because I didn't know what I would find.
Now, what's your impression to Premier Zhou Enlai?
I developed great admiration for Zhou Enlai. He was intelligent, thoughtful, patient, and knew how to concentrate on the main subject. People say we were personal friends. That is only true in the sense that we began to have appreciation for each other's point of view. He was he conducted the foreign policy of his country, and I conducted the foreign policy of our country. But we had great mutual respect.
在华48小时，谈判桌上有何反复？
Communique issue was who invited who. And Mao settled it by saying, why don't we imply they both invited each other?
从用筷子到喝茅台，他如何评价中国文化？
Can you drink Maltai?
And I drank it for my country. But I enjoyed it too. It's a very strong liquor.
精彩继续，不要走开。周恩来总理的个人魅力，对1971年秘密访华的美国国家安全事务助理亨利·基辛格产生了很大的影响。他曾公开表示，周恩来是我在60年来的公职生涯中遇到过的最有魅力的人。而基辛格的秘密中国之行是中美断绝关系20年后出现的首次高层会谈。用他的话而言，正是周恩来含蓄敏感的风格，帮我们克服了曾互为仇敌的2个大国转型关系中的很多隐患，为尼克松总统1972年对中国的历史性访华和中美建立外交关系奠定了基础。如果说尼克松是打开中国之路的构想者，亨利·基辛格博士则是为此战略构想搭建美国、俄罗斯和中国的大三角政策框架，并成功付诸实践的总工程师。
Through long negotiation, U.S. and China announced the invitation to President Nixon. When arriving in Beijing in February 1972, what was the difference compared with the previous time?
Well, actually, the negotiation for the communique in July 1971 took very little time. I was here 48 hours, and most of the time was spent on other subjects. The communique issue was who invited whom. And Mao settled it by saying, why don't we imply they both invited each other? Now, in 1972, we knew what we would find, because I had been in China after July. I came back in October. And Premier Zhou Enlai and I agreed on 9/10 of the Shanghai communique, except for the part on Taiwan. And so we knew it would still be, we hadn't met Chairman Mao yet, so we knew that that was a challenge. And we were more confident when we arrived here in February with President Nixon.
1972年隆冬的一个上午，当美国空军1号徐徐降落在北京首都机场，尼克松总统走下舷梯，与周恩来总理握手的瞬间，顿时凝固成一幅永恒的历史画面，从此开启了中美两国关系的新纪元。基辛格对毛泽东主席更是推崇备至。他在回忆录中说，当周恩来向我说了毛主席想会见总统的意思时，总统和我就立即动身，去和这位现代史上的巨人做第一次会晤。相对于周恩来的鞭辟入里，基辛格觉得毛主席话语要尖锐犀利得多。那句让我退一步等于退1万年，振聋发聩。40年过去了，基辛格仍清楚地记得那段对话。
Do you still remember the contents talk with Chairman Mao? It is said that Mao said, "One step backwards means return 10,000 years."
I remember the conversation. I remember the conversation very well, and it was a very significant conversation in which both President Nixon and Chairman Mao made clear that as far as their leadership was concerned, they would make a significant effort to bring the countries closer together.
据当年《时代周刊》报道，凡是眼睛管点用的人都能看出来，基辛格从中国回来胖了5磅。原本喜爱中餐的他，在北京自然饕餮一番。不过，他对茅台酒更感兴趣，还饶有兴趣地分享了一段轶事。
Did you enjoy the state banquet at that time? Were you able to use chopsticks, and were you accustomed to Chinese food?
Well, I always liked Chinese food, but what I knew as Chinese food was Chinese American food. And Chinese food, it's a little bit different. And then the food inside China also differs, as you know better than I do, from city to city. So now I can use chopsticks, but not as well as the Chinese can. And I love Chinese food.
What about the Mao Tai? Can you drink Mao Tai?
Well, I tell you, I normally don't drink alcohol. But the China that we visited in 1971, they had maybe 15 courses at banquets, and they drank a toast after every course. So, and I drank it for my country. But I enjoyed it too. It's a very strong liquor. And then when President Nixon came home from China, he wanted to prove to his daughters how powerful Mao Tai was. So he poured a bottle of Mao Tai into a bowl on the dining room table. I was there, and he held a match to it to show how strong it was. And the Mao Tai started burning, and the bowl broke, and the fire spread all over the table, and they had to call the White House Fire Department to put out the fire.
关于重磅力作《论中国》，他期待传递怎样的讯号？
I try to describe the Chinese leaders to an American audience, the different approaches that the various leaders took.
已近7夷之年，他依然充满活力，究竟有何秘诀？
I have never understood why people think retirement is such a good thing.
精彩继续，马上回来。距离1971年基辛格首次秘密访华，已经过去了40多个年头。在这几近半个世纪的岁月中，基辛格曾先后50多次访问中国，尽情施展他的破冰地位、超群智慧和影响力，成为中美关系的一条十分重要的非正式沟通渠道，也把自己塑造成当今美国首屈一指的中国通。在他《论中国》的专著中，除了详述中国过去数十年的巨变和中美关系的演变之外，还注入了许多他个人与中国领导人的接触与互动。
You have visited China many times these days.
Yes.
Have you noticed many changes in China? And how do you comment on our opening up and the reform policy?
If anybody had told me when I came first to Beijing and Shanghai what the two cities would look like 30 years later, I would have thought that was absolutely impossible. There were no cars on the street. There were no high-rise buildings. There was no Prud'hon in Shanghai. So the changes are unbelievable that have occurred since then. I had the honor of knowing Deng Xiaoping and have many conversations with him. And I always favored the reform and opening up. And it's a tremendous achievement. And I noticed that the newly appointed government here has also committed itself to further reform and opening up. Each leader represented the problems of his generation. So there has been a significant change in the attitude of the leaders because China has changed so much. Mao was a revolutionary, prophetic leader. The succeeding generations had to deal with reform and to run a very complicated society. But it's remarkable how each generation of Chinese leaders has produced personalities that were appropriate to its special problems. And as I pointed out in the book I wrote, I try to describe these Chinese leaders to an American audience so that they would understand the different approaches that the various leaders took. But they all, I would say, there is a certain difference between Chinese and American leaders. American leaders want to deal with a problem. Chinese leaders deal with a concept. American leaders say there's a solution. Chinese leaders think that every solution is another problem.
So Chairman Mao talk about the philosophy with you.
He always called me a philosopher. And he talked philosophy with me, yes.
基辛格被誉为政坛常青树，虽远离政治公职多年，却从未淡出公众视线。已近7夷之年，按理完全可以含饴弄孙，颐养天年，但基辛格却仍奔波于世界各地，并埋首著书。在他看来，工作就是享受生活。
As we know, you were born in 1923, but you still keep active. Is there any secret keeping in a journey at the age of 90?
Well, I have never understood why people think retirement is such a good thing. And a lot of people say they're looking forward to retirement. I enjoy working. I work on problems that I believe are important. I believe Sino-American relations is one of those problems. And I believe helping educate the American public on foreign policy is important. So I devote my time to it, but it's not a sacrifice. It's something I enjoy.
Do you have some hobbies besides your work?
I like to read. I don't know whether you call that a hobby. I like to swim, but not as a hobby. I would say I spend most of my time either working or discussing. Depends how you define work, because I do many different things.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kissinger. I sincerely wish you will have a wonderful time in China.
Thank you
very much.